Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube videos. You can catch the Podbean podcast on Apple and Spotify. Now I sound like Joe Rogan. You can get it on Apple and Spotify. And I'm bald like Joe Rogan. Anyway, I told these two guys, these two yokels that I have on today, hey, I'm getting the band back together because I so much enjoyed our first conversation on John Courtney Murray and the Catholic Worker Movement and so on. And this is part two. And I'm speaking of none other than the Michael Baxter, teaches at Regis University in, where is that? Denver, right? Denver. Right. And for some reason, I had a temporary panic attack. They're thinking, oh, wait a minute. No, it's not in Denver. It's outside of Denver. No, it's in Denver. And then we have Benjamin Peters, who's at St. Joseph's University College. There's my dog barking. St. Joseph's in Connecticut. And they're both professors of religious studies, theology, that kind of thing. And we're going to launch right into this. Sorry for the very unprofessional, slipshod nature of those introductions. But I didn't really take a whole lot of time to download massive biographies of both of you because I'm really both of these guys, if you listen to the last podcast, are deeply involved in the Catholic worker movement. In fact, I did a standalone interview with Benjamin Peters about his book called To Be Saints, right there. I don't know if I showed this before, Dorothy Day's retreat notebooks and so forth. It's about the Hugo retreats and many other things that Dorothy Day was about in terms of her spirituality. Anyway, so we want to continue our discussion today. I wanted to get back to these guys because we really spent a lot of time last time talking about Merca and John Courtney Murray and liberalism and so on. And I wanted to really do a deep dumpster dive and dig down into it a little bit further. To that end, I wanted to talk a little bit about some issues near and dear to the heart and soul of the Catholic worker movement. We're going to talk about the worker movement in a second, about its status and so on. But one of the things that we didn't discuss in the last episode that I think really needs to discuss is that Dorothy Day and Peter Moore and the early lights of the Catholic worker movement were deeply critical of capitalism. However you want to define capitalism, in many ways, one could simply say concretely that they were critical of whatever you want to call the economic system that currently governs America and Europe and most of the world. Whatever label you want to put on that, and it's convenient to call it capitalism, they were critical of that. So I'm going to turn it over to my two guests. I'm going to start with Mike Baxter and then go up to Ben. Mike, what do you make of Dorothy's critique of capitalism, and do you think that it is still pertinent today?
I do think it's pertinent today. And I guess the way I look at her critique of capitalism was that she got a lot of what she ended up criticizing about capitalism from her pre-conversion days in the 19 teens and 20s, when
Yeah.
she was part of the old left. And she doesn't hide this at all in The Long Loneliness. She's very clear about her own roots in old left circles. She at one point lists all the different branches of left wing, in one way or another, Marxist thought, the kind of traditional Marxists who say just wait for the unfolding of the dialectic and the contradictions of capitalism, the system will collapse in on itself. Or the direct actionists who said, no, we have to take action, intervene in this social order and create a new community now. That's what she favored. Those were the Wobblies. And then the socialists, the ones who wanted to, win over the state. And she was wary of that. She interviewed Trotsky back in 1917, not long before Trotsky made his way back to Russia and the revolution. And one key point in The Long Loneliness, she quotes Trotsky something to the effect of those who try to win the state get won by the state. So that the socialist agenda of a lot of people on the old left was something that she thought was a trap. Anyway, she gets into all this um, in The Long Loneliness and lets it be known
Yes.
that she is part of the old left. And to be writing this in 1952, at the height of the Cold War, the McCarthy years, was a courageous and provocative thing to do. So she felt that the economic system is best understood as those who, the haves and the have-nots. The people who own the means of production, control those means of production, use the means of production to get what profit they can, and will use workers to the extent that it satisfies those ends. And that was certainly true, in the early 20th century. And, and she even cites books like, the classic Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, a very powerful book. And she read it when she was young. And she read Dickens, and Dickens is full of stories about people who are the have-nots, the forgotten ones. And
Yeah.
she just thought that this economy in the United States operates like that. Um, and the question, I suppose, would be, does it still operate like that? And the answer, I suppose, I would give is yes. And the best way to find out how it operates is to go to talk to those who are workers. Um, one time I was in California, in Santa Cruz, or south of Santa Cruz, Watkinsville, and
Watsonville?
pardon, Watsonville. Yes,
Watsonville, where they grow all the strawberries. Yes, I know it
strawberries.
well.
Yeah, it's a Driscoll, the company, and you drive through there, and there's just hundreds of people picking strawberries.
Yeah.
What are they getting paid? I go up the street and I get their strawberries. What are they getting paid? And what are their working conditions and so on? These are still relevant questions. When I was working, I after leaving Notre Dame in 2011, I ended up teaching at DePaul for a few years, and I got involved with the union. I didn't get involved. I brought my students down to meet people in the union. The union was called Unite Here. And there's some Notre Dame students who were involved in that union in Indianapolis and elsewhere. And so they put me in touch with Unite Here in Chicago. And I brought my students down to a strike. They were striking the Hyatt in the Magnificent Mile. And it was moving to hear those stories of people who came, who are working the hotels,
Yeah. Yeah.
who are, whose assignment is to, do 12 rooms a day. And then arbitrarily, or not arbitrarily, not indifferently, but in order to get more efficiency out of these workers, they would say, now you have 14 rooms a day to do, and they wouldn't raise the pay and so on. This is happening all over still, and we just have to, I think, listen for the stories and the experiences of workers. And I think Dorothy was wonderful about that. She was she described herself first and foremost as a journalist.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, and she was committed to reporting on what was going on among workers. Peter Morin wasn't so thrilled about that. His phrase, his famous phrase, strikes don't strike me, and so
That's
on.
right.
Dorothy was very clear about that. And she was, until the end of her life, the UFW was launching a gigantic strike in the 70s, and a boycott of some of the, uh, uh, growers in California, and who were giving the short end of the stick, to put it mildly, to farm workers. Cesar Chavez and the UFW were organizing. She was all for it.
Yeah.
And I feel like, in some ways, I think it's true. One criticism or one observation of the Catholic worker these days is that it's not quite as attentive. Not entirely, not all across the board, but it's not as attentive to the issues of workers. It's harder, I think, nowadays to track the issues of workers. Unions have lost the power that they have had before the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan started busting unions. And nevertheless, it's important for us to recapture that and there learn how capitalism works. Olga, the woman who empties the baskets in my office, what does she get paid? And how does that compare to the more than $200,000 a year that the high administrators at Regis University in Denver get paid?
Oh,
Now,
well,
these are real questions, because I would venture to say that Olga works as hard as I do. I get paid a good bit more than her, but I get paid a fraction of what other people get paid at Regis. So, these things are important.
yeah.
And it's all over. It's all over once you
Oh,
start looking.
I have a
Anyway,
million, I have a million questions I want to ask you about that, but I want to turn it over to Ben first to see if he wants to piggyback on those comments, add any of his own, or even if he wants to ask some questions, raise some points.
Oh, I was thinking, while yeah, the unions maybe aren't what things were back in the 30s or the 40s, there is a kind of a resurgence now, in union activities,
yeah.
whether it's at places like Starbucks or Amazon, and these are very, I mean, my students know people who work in the Amazon warehouse, a stone's throw from campus, and I always think when I think of the stories you hear about kind of what an Amazon warehouse worker is like, and kind of the dehumanizing activities that like the robots are in charge. I think of Peter Morin's critique of kind of wage capitalism as this dehumanizing, and that's what I was going to add on to what Mike was saying about Dorothy. That I think not only did Dorothy kind of bring a sensibility from the old left and a critique of the old left, but I think what she really appreciated when she met Peter, and kind of that magic that happens when she meets Peter, is because I think, especially when you read the earlier accounts in the Long Loneliness, after she becomes Catholic, and she's saying, where are all the clerics in these marches, and she's still going,
Yeah.
and covering all the hunger strikes and hunger marches, and she thinks, well, now that I'm a Catholic, I can't be with these folks because they're communists, and then she meets Peter, and at least in her telling, it's like he opens this world, right? Like his famous line, like the hidden dynamite of the church, that there's these social encyclicals, and also offer a very vivid critique of capitalism. So I think it's probably important to remember that when Dorothy is making these criticisms, especially once the Catholic work gets off the ground, that she's really, and I think, there's the story of why they call it the Catholic worker and not the Catholic radical, or the Catholic, right?
Right.
And she wants to answer that kind of Marxist critique that Catholics have nothing to say about this. And I think I think a big part of especially those early years of the Catholic worker, was really to show that the Catholic Church does offer not only a strong critique of capitalism and sort of what Peter Morin calls wage slavery, but also offers then a positive alternative of what could an economic system that wasn't a kind of a totalitarian communism on the one hand, but also wasn't kind of this individualism and competition within capitalism on the other hand. And that's where things like distributism and kind of a union centered or community centered notion of economics come in, and sometimes that gets a little romanticized, and Peter was always about there's no unemployment on the land and a back to the land movement, but I think it's probably important to remember that there was that kind of twofold, that there was not only a kind of critique of capitalism, but then a sort of a positive view of building a society where it's easier for people to be good, and really seeing that's fundamentally that's the problem with capitalism. I mean, that's anyways how I try to get my students to kind of look at it. Like, does this system make it easier for you to help other people out, or does it make you feel like you're in competition? If you pay more at Walmart, so the workers make more, that means you're going to have to pay more. And there's always this sense of competition as opposed to more of a sense of cooperation. So I think having keeping those two branches of this criticism in mind is important as well.
Michael?
A couple of examples, because I do suffer from the romanticism that Ben points out, but I have had ideas and partial visions, imaginations of how things could be done differently. And
that was going to be my next question. But before you get into that, I do want to ask one question before we move on to how can we do things differently. I do agree with your assessment of capitalism in the modern world as an economic system of haves and have-nots. However, I have also read statistics, and I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just being devil's advocate, that says that actually poverty has decreased worldwide, and modern economic systems, the global corporate capitalist system, has in fact generated the greatest amount of material well-being for the average citizen that the world has ever seen. And I, quite frankly, I'm not an economist. I'm a dilettante in these matters. And I don't know what to make of those kinds of observations, those kinds of statements. So before we move on to what can we do that we better, let's at least plumb the depths just a bit of the criticisms of the position that all three of us hold, that there's a problem with capitalism. So maybe Michael, you could address that.
Yeah, I got two responses to that. One, and both of these are taken from my reading and studying of things by Alistair McIntyre. But the first response that I want to say to that is that it's true in a certain sense that poverty has been alleviated in a lot of parts of the world. And I suppose you could say it's due to capitalism. And critics of capitalism have to admit it's good for people not to go hungry. It's good that some of these things have been alleviated, some of these sufferings. But at the same time, it's also important to know that a lot of suffering has not been alleviated, and that people still starve in the world today every minute that we speak. And that workers are still inhibited from flourishing, to use both a Marxist and Aristotelian term, are still prohibited from flourishing because of the way the market operates. At one point or another, workers will be seen as mere instruments for capital, and they'll get, for example, laid off and so on. And look at all the layoffs that are going on, in all sorts of industries now and in the future with artificial intelligence. People are just not going to survive. And the logic of capitalism says we're going to do what works to advance the profits, and that's what's going to be the final arbiter, the bottom line, and so on. So in one sense, that's a key thing to remember, even though we concede the point that you make, and people like Michael Novak used to make ad nauseum. The other thing is that capitalism not only oppresses workers by depriving them of their full humanity, a work life that works and makes sense, but also it tears apart ways of life. This argument over standard of living has increased under capitalism was countered by the great historian who McIntyre was very involved in, by the name of E.P. Thompson, who wrote the classic book, The Making of the English Working Class. And what he points out throughout the book, and against apologists of capitalism from the West, what he points out is that whole ways of life were destroyed with the Industrial Revolution. Clothes were made more efficiently, but whole ways of production and whole ways of living close to the land, in villages, in small businesses, in cooperative arrangements where the market was used to sell excess goods beyond what people could sell and people needed locally. But nevertheless, markets didn't ravage whole ways of life. And it's no coincidence that the commons, lands, and so on and so forth were seized by the government, in England in the early 19th century, and so on and so forth. So that what we
Well,
need,
Eugene McCarraher makes that great point in his book, The Enchantments of Mammon.
yes, what we need to look at is not just standards of living, but ways of life. And I think this taps into what both Dorothy and even more so Peter were trying to recover, or as Peter put it, reconstruct. Like we want to construct communities and sort of retrieve or restore a more localist
Yeah.
understanding of.
Yeah.
I imagine this is what you're trying to do over there in your farm, and
It
that's
is
what.
a little, yeah. Peter Morin, we say, was a back to the lander localist before his time, and so on. But I do want to repeat. I tossed it out there as a throwaway line because my listeners sometimes like to actually buy the books that I suggest. But Eugene McCarraher's book, does he still teach at Villanova? I think he does. The Enchantments of Mammon. It's a lifetime achievement award book. It's huge. It'd take you a while to read it, but he lays out such a beautiful case, I think, for the deeply, deeply flawed nature of our modern economic system and the historical antecedents that led up to this. And the point he's making is that it didn't have to be this way.
Yeah, I was just speaking to a bunch of business people at Regis over the weekend. A guy from Benedictine college came out, Dave Geenans,
Oh,
and
I have his book.
oh, and we had an interesting exchange. He wants to take back America, and he wants to have a kind of Catholic inflection to capitalism and so on. I'm a little wary of this, but one of the points I made was that we have to beware of the ideology that says how things are is how they must be.
That's right.
And we tend to get trained by our social setting to think in certain ways to capture our imagination. I'm sure Gene talks about this. And so that we think things can't be. But I feel like the worker, Peter Moore, Dorothy, they all said, no, things don't need to be the way they are. They can be different, and we can be idealists. And if we're idealists now, that will become the reality down the road.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to that.
Well,
Ben, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think what kind of piggybacks on that then is also the criticism of capitalism that you get with Pope Francis and Laudato Si, that that the lifestyle that people in the United States live is unsustainable for the whole planet. If the goal of if what the critics that you brought up in the beginning, who would kind of criticize us, say, well, the standard of living have gone up, that is an unsustainable, like that that the current climate change crisis or crisis of lack of or whatever you want to call it that's going on the planet right now kind of reflects this idea that there are limits to the amount of resources that we have on the planet. And so that the kind of endless consumption or drive to consumption that is also at the core of capitalism, right, is just something that I think is bringing now the whole planet to kind of a what the Pope is trying to point out, a kind of breaking point. And so if what we're supposed to be, and I know Gustavo Gutierrez talks about that idea of calling something the developing world. What are they developing into? And if the goal of what they're developing into is to become little middle class, American consumers, that there's just not enough on the planet. And so instead of saying we just need to keep consuming more, and maybe those lost ways of life that you and Mike are kind of talking about, that kind of get ravaged, that those are the things that we need to start looking more at, that were those more sustainable practices, where people maybe didn't have 3 flat screen TVs in their house and 2 cars in the driveway, but people were able to take care of their families, and people were fed, and people weren't crowded into slums and cities, but instead lived in a more, back to the land kind of way.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? The smaller that our families became in terms of numbers of children, the larger our houses got. I mean, I was one of 5 children, grew up in the 60s in Lincoln, Nebraska, in a tiny little ranch house with 3 bedrooms,
Yeah.
5 kids, 1 bathroom. My father nailed some blankets up on the rafters in the basement to make different rooms for the boys downstairs. And that's how we lived. And we didn't even know that we were deprived, because we weren't deprived. So yeah. And I think too, to bring this, I tend to be dystopian about these things, and I'll explain why here in a second. Talking about Laudato Si, which I think is the best of Pope Francis's writings, and that we need to change our consumer mentality. Think, for example, that of states like New Jersey and California that have outlawed single source plastics, so that you can't have plastic straws. So the straws are paper. The straws are wrapped in plastic, which makes no sense. Okay, lots of people have pointed this out recently. They show on social media, here's the straw I got at Starbucks, the paper straw, and it's wrapped in plastic. Likewise, both in California and New Jersey have noticed an absolute explosion increase in the use of plastic as soon as plastic grocery bags were outlawed. People started buying those reusable bags you get at the grocery store. But guess what? They're made of plastic. And what has happened is that people were throwing those away and they're just buying new ones when they go to the store. And so you ended up with this massive, this was an article I read just last week. New Jersey has ended up with an increase in plastics all over the place as a result of outlawing single-use plastics. But the point is, the root cause of this is a consumerist mentality.
No, there's I don't know if you guys saw, there was this great op-ed in the New York Times last Sunday on the fake meat industry, and that there was this push about 3 or 4 years ago that you could create real meat in a factory. So it wasn't veggie meat that tastes like meat. It was taking a cell, and billions of dollars went into the research, and nothing has come of it. But what the author of the article was writing is, at the heart of it was, and he doesn't refer to Pope Francis, but it's what he calls that technocratic paradigm, that I don't have to stop my lifestyle. I can still eat steak every night. It's just technology will fix it. So now the steak isn't as bad for the planet as these huge feedlots out in your old state of Nebraska, and all that those things cause. So like the idea that I have to change my lifestyle and maybe not eat as much meat or not eat as many of these things, that's off the table. I just look for, well, I'll have science fix it. So now we have meat that's just better. And it's just this big myth. And they were kind of saying, could that $3 billion have been spent in some other way to address, all the problems that they were hoping?
Yes.
But it just wasn't as sexy as, no. We're going to let, and I often think about this with electric cars. Like, no, everybody's electric car. You can keep driving all you want. We'll just make cars that are a little less bad than gas, as opposed to just drive less or bike more or walk more or do some, but we don't want to.
Or invest in mass transit so that we can actually have cities. One of the things I love about New York City, one of the things I loved about the time I lived in Rome, is that there are cities in which you don't have to own a car, where you can actually get around and live without a car. And I think we need to design cities like that. Anyway, but I want to move. This is all a preamble. I want to move on to the question that Mike started to ask, which is, assuming that there are these problems, social dislocations, the destruction of communities, blah, 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 capitalism. How can we imagine it differently? And I said earlier, I tend to be dystopian about these things. I just finished reading a book by a philosopher named Anton Barber-Kay, trained at the University of Chicago, I do believe. And the name of the book is A Web of Our Own Making. It's really good. And he's tends to be dystopian as well. And his point is that you can liken modern globalist techno militarist capitalism to like this ever closing nexus, this ever tightening nexus, so that opting out of the system is becoming less and less and less possible for the average person. And so that's what a web of our own making, that we've created this globalist economic nightmare that has its tentacles everywhere and into everything. And so the imaginative capacity to think differently, and he makes this point, is robbed of us, because it just almost becomes it's like being in a maximum security prison and you're in there life without parole, and the very idea of escape is impossible. And so I throw that out there as a preamble to, okay, Mike, go ahead and discuss what can we do differently? How can we live differently?
I get this question a lot. I raise it a lot when I teach a course on Laudato Si and the ecology. And at the end of the course, the problem that I raise is the problem of hope. How do you hope? The more you learn about the ecological situation in which we live, the more depressing you get, and perhaps the less hopeful. And the only answer I have is to live a life of hope. And that's what enhances and deepens your hope. How do you imagine things differently? I'll give a story. When I was in Andre House in Phoenix, these 40 years ago, we started. After a couple of years, we started a soup line 6 days a week, 300, eventually 600 people a night, 6 nights a week. And we met a lot of people on the soup line. And one of the things that surprised us was how young most of the men, mostly men, on the line were, and that they could work. So we started talking with them about going to work. And we started identifying guys on the line who said they wanted to work. And we started matching them with the really unbelievably broad group of volunteers and donors we had. And after a while, we started thinking we should start a job service where people could get work who were on the line, meet people who were volunteering, and get hired. And we started to do it little by little, one by one, and then 5 by 5. And my vision was that we could actually start a business that would be a temp service. And, back then we used to say, well, you hire a worker on a temp service, $10 an hour. You have to devote $6 an hour to operating costs. You have to pay people, a couple dollars for their pay, and then no, it works like this. You get $10 a day or $10 an hour from a company to move furniture from one building to another. You pay the worker, the way a temp service will work is they'll pay the worker $6 an hour. They'll devote $2 an hour to operating costs, and they take the other $2 for profit. Now, can you tweak that so that you take the $2 for profit and pay people $7.50 an hour, something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're paying people each week, and maybe you start with 20 people, could develop into 40 people who are working for these companies, and then people hear about this and they're ready to hire. There in Phoenix, there was lots of, lawn cutting and all that. And eventually you could incentivize the pay in such a way that you could, people that kept their job for a month, they'd get a raise and get an apartment. And, we would provide some of the provisions that you need to go to work and so on. And at length, we could have the workers run the company and, have worker councils and so on. It would take time. It would take several years, but you could build this company up in such a way that it would be different. This is what Peter Morin meant when he said, we make the encyclicals click. This is what John Paul II sets forth in Centesimus Annus, is this type of free market, this type of worker cooperation, this type of de-objectification of workers to give them their agency back. And I'm convinced that with a little imagination, you can do this. When I was in South Bend, one thing that we found out with Ben and I found out with homeless folks in South Bend, they were great at picking up cans and other stuff that people set out in their alleys, like wash machines and dryers and hot water heaters and so on. And they knew where all this stuff was. And they knew that these things could be taken apart and you could get the aluminum and the copper and get some money out of it. So we thought I had this idea, we should start a little business and we were going to call it Miraculous Metals. And we had these guys go up to Notre Dame and they would pick up cans after football games, come down with these big bags. You get a big bag of cans that was worth $20 at the time. Well, if you get 40 bags like that, that's real money for
now you're talking serious money. And
yes.
I think we need to have a lay revolution in the church on the parish level to help us make parishes hubs of exactly this kind of activity.
Yes.
And before I turn it over to Ben, because I'm sure he's got something he wants to, like, I think of my parish, which is an Anglican ordinariate parish, but it's in the poorest neighborhood in Scranton, PA. We have a crisis pregnancy center that's been started by a parishioner that's right across the street from the church now that we all help out with. We have a casket maker, Marion Caskets, Marcus Daly, my dear friend, and he makes these simple pine caskets. It's a ministry. He's right across the street from the church. We have a doctor, Dr. Philip Huffman, who was a former emergency room doctor. He's just opened up his own practice and basically charges next to nothing to anybody who wants his services as a doctor. And I think, for example, our good friend Bill Portier, his wife Bonnie, she has a medical practice. It's very, very similar to that. She does wonderful work in that regard. These, like George Bush, the older, 1,000 points of light. Isn't that what he said? 1,000 points of light. Now I'm combining Dana Carvey's impression of Bush with Bush, but you get the point that Bush was a Republican, but he wasn't wrong. Okay, about that. Anyway, Ben, go ahead.
I was going to say just to get back to that when you were talking about that prison and the philosopher you were reading, and I wonder if part of it is that prison real, or do we just lack the imagination? Do we just assume it's real? I always find this line great that, I remember reading a review once of one of these zombie movies or kind of apocalyptic movies. And what the reviewer said was, it's easier for us in America to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, right? It's a much easier to assume that the zombie will come, and as opposed to saying, is there some other way that we could be living here? But I agree with you that I think the parishes, that would really be, and it's not for nothing that Peter thought that every Catholic parish should have a house of hospitality, that these are these sites, and I think it's something on the positive level, like you were just laying out, Larry, of things that can happen, ministries, kind of whether it's jobs programs or healthcare. But also, I think of, friends of mine who have kids, my kids' ages, who are just looking, does a 10-year-old need a smartphone? And they just assume, I guess they do, because everybody in their kids' class has a smartphone. And you want to say, well, a Catholic parish should be the place where people can get together and support each other as almost like communities of resistance to this kind of capitalism. So not only as sites where you can be doing these works of mercy, but also as places just, and I think there's this could be one of those great things that I think could really, we're so divided in the church along ideological lines, but I think my friends more on the right and my friends more on the left both say their kids want stuff all the time and they don't like shopping on Amazon, but they don't know what else to do. They don't like having all this technology, but they don't know what else to do. And I think like these places where we could do this kind of stuff and we could support one another, and then that kind of opens up to the next line of, well, then what else could we start doing? And we can start doing this, and suddenly you find, and then that moves to other people. They say, well, this parish is doing this, why can't we do that too? And I think that's that kind of, opening the possibilities. But I think right now we just live in this idea that there's no other options. This is all I can do. I have to shop on Amazon. I have to buy my kids this stuff. We have to have 6 bathrooms in the house. There's no other option. Or 2 cars, or 3 cars, or 4 cars.
Or the birthday party industry for small kids. It drives me crazy.
Or not doing something on a Sunday, having a Sabbath.
Well, how about this? How about we get at least start by getting Catholic parishes not to have CYO sports on Sunday morning? How about that? I went through that as a parent. How about this? Not spending $65,000 on your wedding. How about that? That's been a vendetta of mine ever since my wedding. And that the money we spent on the wedding, and my wife will kill me.
Dan Berrigan used to say, he came down to Andre House, gave a retreat to us, very memorable. And one of the things he said in talking about Acts 5 with Ananias and Sapphira was matrimony, marriage is the most degraded of the sacraments. And I think that's true in the way that it's just become.
Yeah. I agree. Go ahead, Ben.
To say, I just think people I hear so many people who kind of, roll their eyes and say, yeah, I don't, but no one, then they kind of fall with, I just don't know what else there is to do. And so I think it's that lack of imagination that, again, to think of the Catholic worker notion of building a society where it's easy. I think we can do these things. And I think we can follow what Dorothy and Peter had in offering alternatives.
I think it was, it was David Schindler, David L. Schindler, the elder, who's just the late great, who said that the worst thing of all about modernity is that it robs us of the ability to imagine anything different, like you were talking about earlier, Michael. When we have to be able to imagine that it could be different. It didn't have to be this way. Let's move on, though. There are all these ways that we can take concrete action to ameliorate. I mean, I like what you said, Mike. The way to be hopeful is to actually just live hopefully, right? And you will become what it is that you do. And if you live hopefully, then hopefully hope will develop out of that hope. Anyway, but that then, to me, though, it raises another issue about the military-industrial complex. All right, we've been talking about capitalism. I made a post on Twitter, X, whatever it is, the other day. It was on Facebook as well, in which I said one of the things that I've learned in my 65 years is that there's one thing I know about the American government, and that is that it lies, and it lies about its lies, and it's lied so much that you can't trust it with regard to anything, and so it would seem to me that there's always a prima facie case to be made that no war could possibly be just that this nation wages, but because you can never trust whether or not this government is telling the truth about the reasons for going to war. And what provoked that from me was that some guy who worked in American intelligence leaked something about how the Russians are putting nuclear bombs in space or something or other. And this was last week. And that created this massive hysteria. And so I thought, well, how do we know that's true? And how do we know we don't have nuclear bombs in space? We don't know that any of that is true. So my point, it's part of my dystopian curmudgeonly nature. my point is that this isn't just a question of economics. The system that we live within is an amalgamation of economics and power, not just the power of wealth, but actually imperial power, the extension of our wealth through the means of force. And that America is constantly on a war footing and has been since World War II. So so before we get on to the end point here, which is talking about the state of the Catholic worker movement, which may have to wait till a future thing. How do we who are interested in the Catholic worker vision and Dorothy's vision about issues of war and peace? And I know Martha Hennessy and some of the Plowshare Seven who went down, and did the vigilante action at the nuclear site. And I believe it was North Carolina, or maybe it was Virginia. I can't remember now. Anyway, what do we do? What do we do to combat that part of our economic system, this militarist part?
Well,
Michael? I'll go, Ben.
Well, I was gonna say, just real quick. First, give up hope that we can somehow transform it or take control of that. I think there's been this long, and we talked about this last time with John Courtney Murray, this long kind of running Catholic narrative that Catholics can somehow save all of this, or Catholics can redeem all of this. And I think, Larry, that very powerful statement you just kind of made about this is almost inherent to the American project. And so maybe the first thing we should do is sort of give up this sort of naivete that, oh no, if we just get enough Catholics in the military, or if we just get enough Catholic CEOs of Pratt Whitney and Lockheed Martin, then everything will be better because they'll listen to what Pope, let's just stop that charade and say we really have to kind of treat this as an unchristian, if not anti-Christian milieu that we live in, and move from there and make that our starting point. I think,
as Dorothy said, yeah, there are some professions simply that a Catholic should not be able to be engaged in. But anyway, Michael, go ahead.
We used to talk about this a lot at Notre Dame. Ben and I were both at Notre Dame in the early 2000s, and people would say, ROTC students, who are so often the best students that you have in
yeah.
The Department of Defense knows how to use goodness to evil ends. But these were great students, and they would argue that we're going to Christianize the military. But then other students would counter, well, no, you're just going to militarize Christianity. And I think that we see this now, this kind of emergent Christian nationalism, almost unapologetically now, although my own view is that this has been the norm for, say, all of Dorothy's life and prior to that. So World War I, if there was a turning point, I would point to that. Another thing I would want to say is when you look at this gigantic system, it can get depressing. One thing you can do, and I feel like we should do as a church, if we're going to criticize war, if we're going to decry nuclear weapons, we have to help people in the military who feel so moved to get out, to leave.
Or more broadly, the whole military industrial complex. You're building aircraft carriers and you're building.
Yeah, I think this is so true. I mean, I told you I did my master's thesis at Mount St. Mary's under Germain Grisey. And the gist of it was that the American nuclear deterrent is immoral, gravely so, and that no Catholic can participate in it. And it's funny, it's back in the day before computers. This is the 1980s. So I wrote the thesis out longhand on a legal pad. And I didn't have a working typewriter at the time. It's a long story. So I found this guy, and people used to do this. They used to, you'd pay them to type up your stuff.
Yes.
Typists, right? So I gave him this 125-page, thesis, and he typed it. Well, it turns out the guy was in the Nebraska National Guard, and he gave it to his sergeant because he thought it was so interesting when they got it done. And both of them ended up leaving the Nebraska National Guard because they were both Catholics, and they were so moved by the argument. And what the typist said to me was, Nobody had ever presented that argument to them. That was
Yeah.
the first time they had ever heard the argument. All they had ever heard from anybody in the church was, "You're fine. You're go ahead."
No, and I, I have a friend who works at Pratt Whitney, and he was telling me that when the news of what was going on in Yemen and sort of the Saudi Arabian bombing of Yemen, and that Pratt and Whitney was involved in making some of that aircraft, that people on the military side of Pratt Whitney just said, I can't do this anymore. I can't
Yeah.
continue to. And I think so. I think this is much broader. I mean, I think we oftentimes focus on soldiers, but I think, as you guys both point out, this is a much broader. And I think there's the bishop in Amarillo, Texas, right, who very kind of bravely came out and said, Catholics should not be working in factories that make nuclear weapons. And I think more of that kind of, because I think people are realizing it on their own. But I think if we really could give people the feel, like you were doing with your thesis, give people the theological justification, because oftentimes what they're met with is, what are you talking about? It's not a problem. You're all you're doing is building the airplane. You're not dropping the bombs on the Yemeni refugees, so don't worry about it. But there's
it's remote, remote cooperation. Yeah, I can't wait to read the com box underneath this YouTube video when it comes out, or the emails I'm going to get about, because that's the argument that people do make, is the one Michael mentioned earlier, that if you get all the Catholics out of the nuclear missile silos, then what you certainly hope for is that there will still be people of conscience in those silos who who will not turn the key. I had one guy, I think it was a comment in the last one, said that, and it's true, there was a famous incident in the Soviet Union where there was some kind of a computer glitch, and the Soviets were convinced that the United States was attacking them, and there was one man stood up to it and said, this might be a mistake, and let's not incinerate half the planet on a mistake. And he turned out to be right. And so the point would be, okay, don't we need Catholics to be down in those silos? But I don't think that's a cogent argument, because I think more often than not, what happens is the Catholic gets co-opted by the mentality of the silo than the other way around. Anyway, Michael.
And into being part of a system that can bring the whole planet to the brink of extinction in an hour. I think that's also a problem.
Well, Archbishop Wester of Santa Fe has brought these issues to the fore a couple of years ago. It's he's in New Mexico, site of Los Alamos Laboratories, which still operates, and Alamogordo, which is where the first nuclear weapon was ever detonated in 1945, before the bombs were dropped. Oppenheimer, the movie, has really drawn a lot of interest to this again, and he's making that argument, and it really needs to be made. I think of Bishop McElroy. He has decried nuclear weapons along, the lines of Pope Francis in recent statements over the last 7 or 8 years. But I also think Bishop McElroy needs to attend to the people in his diocese who work at the Naval Shipyard.
Yeah, in San Diego.
And up in Camp Pendleton, where all the Marines are. And that really we need to... Again, I feel like, be present for those in the military who may have conscience qualms about this.
Yeah.
And that, Ben and I were both involved in the Catholic Peace Fellowship, and one of our little slogans was, we want to stop war one person at a time, one by one by one. This personless approach that Dorothy, I think, wanted to, and Ben's been doing work on Gordon Zahn. There's a great figure in the 20th century who really wanted to raise these questions. I think the irony, Larry, you'll like this, the irony is that we have now many in the church who are calling for a new paradigm in moral theology, whereas the older more traditional paradigm set forth in Veritatis Splendor provides the basis for the pastoral work that needs to be done so that people can feel better about not cooperating with evil. And in all these ways, whether it be defense industries or direct military service and so on. Anyway, it's again, you have to just do the work little by little. It's the only way to be hopeful.
Go ahead.
When Martha and those folks go get arrested in the Kings Bay, I think it's great. That's one way of doing this. But there's many other ways that we can work for peace too. And we all let 10,000 flowers bloom when it comes to this.
I agree. Ben, I'll let you get a word in edgewise here eventually. But I do want to, along those lines, to bring up our friend Bill Portier again. I remember years and years ago at some conference, I went to so many, we all do. They all run together. But Bill presented a paper. In that paper, he floated the idea that the church needs to develop a penance service of healing and reparation. In other words, what we're talking about here isn't to judge Catholic soldiers. We're not here to heap coals of blame and hostility upon, but to use a much overused term, to accompany, to help them get out of the military in whatever way we can, if they have a conscience qualm about it. But also for those who remain in the military. I have a very, very dear friend, I won't say who, his son joined the Coast Guard. And in the Coast Guard, I know the son very, very, very well. Salt of the earth kid, great, great young man, Catholic. Joined the Coast Guard, got stationed down in the Caribbean, in the Gulf Coast, and essentially on a Coast Guard boat that was interdicting drug runners. Well, they figured out that my friend's son was a pretty good sharpshooter. He was very good in sniper school. So they gave him the job of sniping and shooting the drug runners. If the gunboat's coming towards the Coast Guard ship and they've got, guns shooting at the ship, this young kid's job, my friend's son, was to take them out. And he did. Now he suffers from enormous problems, right? Because he believes that what he did was just. He believes that what he did was self-defense. These were evil, bad men bringing drugs into our country, and they were attacking his ship. Okay, fine. So there was no question in his mind he did something immoral, but he killed people. He killed people, and that left a mark on his soul. And anybody that's ever been in war, and I've never been in war, but I know people who have, to say that it leaves a mark on your soul. And it seems to me that Bill Portier was entirely correct in that paper that he presented, that we need some kind of a liturgical service, a penance service, a healing service of some kind. And I remember my late, great, dear departed Jesuit friend, Father Edward Oakes, who was my dissertation director, being livid with Bill Portier over that paper, livid. He thought it was the stupidest thing that he had ever heard, precisely because if you're killing people in a just war, then you should have no guilt over it. And I thought, Ed. Of course,
he didn't know what war is like, because war inflicts people with what people in this area call moral injury, and they undertake what they call soul repair, and that's just a reality of returning soldiers. Coming home again, it takes a lifetime. Coming home from war takes a lifetime.
And it isn't even, I don't even think it's, I mean, there's stories now about, speaking of the Coast Guard, about Coast Guard boats that are pulling out Haitian refugees out of the ocean.
And he's done that too.
Accompanied children. And they're told, just bring them back to Port-au-Prince. And there are these stories of these Coast Guard, they're not shooting anybody, they're not killing anybody, but they're fishing 5- and 6-year-old orphans out of dinghies in the boats, and then just dropping them off on a harbor, and the kids are crying, and these Coast Guard, shipmen or whatever they're called, cadets are coming back again with this sense of moral injury, and because not because they even killed anybody, but because they're wondering, I have a 5-year-old daughter at home, and I just took this 5-year-old girl, and did I leave her with, kidnap? I mean, like, and so all of this, trying to work for this, what you're kind of calling this military industrial complex, I think it spans even beyond the guy with the gun, right? It goes to this whole, and that's what you can see, like the person who makes the guns, or the person who sells the guns, or the person who, all of those people begin to get pulled into this system. And I think my friend, at Pratt Whitney was pointing out that even on the engineering level, there are people who are starting to say, what are we doing this for? And should we be doing this? And people are saying, well, of course, you're not in charge of what they use the weapons for. You're just building the weapons, in some hope, I guess, that they get used, but one of the points too, I was thinking as you guys were talking is, so as Mike mentioned, I'm doing work with Gordon Zahn, who's famously, his kind of most famous achievement was kind of discovering Franz Jägerstätter, the story of this German or this Austrian Catholic who's executed by the Nazis after he gets drafted and refuses to fight in Hitler's army, despite the fact that every priest and bishop and Catholic cleric he went to for advice said, just go do it. You're not in charge of deciding if the war is just or not. You have to think about yourself and do your duty. But one of the things that Zahn often talked about is that in Catholic moral theology, we have this thing called the presumption of justice that we give to the nation state, that we presume that in times of war, there's a presumption given to the nation that the war is just. And what Zahn said is, and this kind of goes back, Larry, to what you were kind of talking about, and that seeing America in this more imperialistic way, that maybe what we need to start, maybe the starting point should be a presumption of injustice. And then the case has to be made that this is something that a Catholic should participate in, whether it's in building the weapons, whether it's in working, serving in the military, as opposed to the starting point being an assumption of justice or a presumption of justice. And I think about that Zahn line a lot, to have the starting point, like the starting point that Jägerstätter had was a presumption of injustice, that Hitler and the Nazis were an unjust regime. And you had to argue to him to prove that they weren't. And nobody who could do that for him. And so then he said, well, I can't participate in this. It would be evil. But I think Catholic theology and Catholic theologians can help out here, and bishops, by maybe giving people more of that critical presumption of injustice. And let's start there and have the nation make the case for why we should be participating in these things. I think that would be another place that we can maybe point to.
Excellent. I think that's very well said. And all these are great suggestions and ideas. I just and I want to leave this with the viewers. We're probably going to wrap this up now. I always get emails saying, okay, with regard to capitalism, well, what system would you recommend? And or blah, blah, what political party would you vote for then, Mr. Smarty Pants? Or, or as George Weigel said to me in Rome last October when I said that nuclear weapons, our nuclear deterrent was immoral. And George said, well, by your logic, we'd all be speaking Russian right now. First off, that's not true. I don't believe that that's true anyway. And second off, I said back to George, and I love George. He's a great guy. He's a friend. I said, George, that makes you a utilitarian. And it just the subject changed, and somebody interjected some other comment, I think, to diffuse the situation. But we have to get rid of this fundamentally utilitarian calculus that we don't bring that to bear in the sexual sphere, right? It's all gravely immoral. There's no utilitarian calculus. There might be subjective mitigation, but there's no utilitarian calculus of means and ends. But when it comes to the military industrial complex, there sure as heck are. And so I'm not a huge fan of Cardinal McElroy for a lot of reasons, but he is absolutely right about the asymmetry in our moral theology.
Yes. And, for your readers or your listeners, Larry, I'm going to mention an article that I know that you know, even though we've never talked about it. It's called The Morality of Obliteration Bombing by John C. Ford. It came
That's
out in
right.
the summer of 1944. It's about 80 pages long. You can get it free on Theological Studies. And it's a long article, but boy, I'll tell you, it's a classic because it makes the strong Catholic case that you
Yes.
just can't directly attack the innocent in war. Um, and he does it from just war grounds.
Oh yeah. Grisey leaned heavily on that Ford article.
It's very powerful. And so these issues, and this is pre-nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And so these issues have been here a long time, and we really need to kind of recover this kind of discourse, which I think is a way to help us through these complicated issues.
Yeah. I mean, the firebombing of Dresden, a lot of Americans are unaware that the American napalm, or the equivalent of then, of napalm bombing of Tokyo, killed more people. I believe this is true, but I believe that it killed more people than the atomic bombs we dropped did, because so many homes in Tokyo are utterly flammable, made of bamboo and paper and things like this. Uh, and we did that deliberately, and that's the kind of thing that Ford was talking about in that article. The height of World War II, he's saying, okay, as Catholics, we just can't obliterate whole cities like this. We're not allowed. Then of course there's the argument, well, it's total war, and there's no such thing as a distinction between combatants and non-combatants anymore, because everybody in that society is implicated via their economic system in the war machine.
Yeah,
Ben, you're shaking. Go ahead.
Oh, that's I just finished a book by Jay Lofton. I forget what his name was. It came out
Robert J. Lifton. Yeah.
called The Myth of Hiroshima. That there's this that and he kind of goes back and tracks the documents to how we talked about the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and where these arguments of no, it would have saved 2 million lives, and first it was a million lives, and before that it was 800,000 lives, and then know that this was a people that just it was a total war, and there was no other way around it. And he kind of pulls apart all of those myths that, as we're celebrating the anniversaries of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even George Weigel brought up the same arguments that have been kind of, that came much later after the bombing for justifying this. And I think that's all worth remembering, and then reading what people at the time were saying, that this was not, that once we start losing this distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and once we start making this argument that it's just total war, that then we've kind of lost any sense of that war can be just. Once we kind of lost that, and
That's right.
Elizabeth Anscombe makes that, and Grisey and Ford, and I think there's a long line going back within Catholic theology, who are not pacifists, by the way. John Ford was
Right.
a pacifist. Anscombe was not a pacifist. I don't know if Grisey was a pacifist.
No, he was not. He believed in it. He justified his position based on just war principles, just as Ford had done in 1944. And just as Mike Baxter was mentioning in our last episode, he said, I believe you said, Mike, that you said you increasingly rely on the just war theory in order to show why most wars are in fact immoral.
Ford at one point in his great article says, if this is the nature of modern warfare, then so much the worse for modern warfare. But we have to simply resist the barbarism of it. I'm really at a loss as to why my good friend Bill Miscampbell doesn't see the utilitarian character of this. He wrote the book, The Most Controversial Decision, defending President Truman's decision to drop the bomb. But I don't know where we're going to wrap up, but it's important to mention that Dorothy Day, at the Eucharistic Congress of 19 1976, decried the use of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki because there was a celebration at the Eucharistic Congress of the military, it being the bicentennial year and so on.
Yeah.
And it was on August 6th.
Oh, geez.
So,
Yeah.
in this year of Eucharistic revival, we need to bring forth the voice of Dorothy Day, servant of God, and her message from years ago to us today, that we need to repent of these deeds and learn how to see. This is what repentance is all about. See things differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, did you went to your bookcase?
You're about to show us a book.
There was this Hiroshima in America, by Robert J. Lifton and Greg Mitchell. But I think both make the case to get to what Mike was just saying. Along, by the way, I also just finished Gary Will's great book, Bomb Power. And both of these books really go a long way in tracing the history of where we are today. And again, Larry, your kind of very impassioned description of the military industrial machine and how they really trace this back to the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and what that's done to our country, not just to our government. Yeah. Will's point that it creates the national security state and secrets and the kind of imperial presidency. Yeah. On both whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. But one of the things that Lifton and Mitchell bring up is it's just, because we like to think of ourselves as the good guys in war, and here was a case where it was very clearly this bomb did not have to be dropped, right? And yeah. They have a lot of historical evidence that the bomb did not have to be dropped, and yet they were dropped. And what that's done to how Americans have had to kind of explain that to ourselves, and that's really shaped a generation or two generation now of Americans to come to accept that our government and the military does things and it's somehow still good and we're somehow still the good guys. And I think that's a kind of myth that certainly Dorothy and a lot of the Catholic worker want to kind of pull the pin out of. So,
well, there is hope, because I did read the other day that the various branches of the United States military are having a hard time filling their ranks these days, and I don't know why that is, but I'm kind of glad to hear that. People are going to man, the emails I'm going to get now. Oh my God, you commie, blah, 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 you communist Marxist, blah blah blah. Dorothy,
at least you're getting viewers.
Oh yeah, but they just there's a certain. I'm just going to be blunt about this, and we do need to wrap up. But, most of my listeners, viewers are on the conservative side of the theological spectrum, as am I, actually. If you look at my Trinitarian theology, my Christology, my ecclesiology, it's all it's Ray Sorsman, it's Guardini, Bouillet, Balthazar, Ratzinger, these guys. And that marks me as, I guess, what you would call in some circles a conservative theologian. And I'm critical of many aspects of progressive Catholic theology, which I think just feeds the Leviathan of the state and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, I do have these Catholic worker views about war and peace. And whenever I do write about them or speak of them, I always get the reactions are very interesting from conservative Catholics who it seems to me still have this, when it comes to issues of national defense and national security, have a utilitarian mindset. I'm just going to leave it at that. Larry, and go ahead.
You got to get rid of these categories, conservative and liberal or progressive. I mean, that's part of the problem.
Yeah, because
in our contemporary,
well, what taxonomy would you replace it with?
Traditional and radical. Traditionally Catholic and radical when it comes to economics and politics. And that may not help you with your listeners, but it is helpful to escape these crushing polarities of left and right, liberal and conservative.
Yeah, Sister Donald Corcoran, a Benedictine nun who knew Dorothy Day, who lived with her for a year in Manhattan when she was a young nun. When Sister Donald was a young nun, she said to me, you know, because we were having this exact same conversation. It's like, I don't know what other shorthand to use: conservative, progressive, liberal, blah, 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 neocon. Blah. She goes, what you are, Larry, what you are is a radical tradition. That's what you believe in. Radical tradition, not a radical traditionalist, but a traditional radical or a radical traditionalist or something along those lines. Not a radical tradition. I can't. I'm mangling what she said, but it's what you just said, Michael. It's what you just said.
Well, I think this also takes us back to last time we talked about Murray and kind of the view of America that I think is shared by people across this political spectrum that we're limited by. Speaking of kind of a lack of imagination, I think as Americans we're sort of given two options, and that's kind of it. And I think, but I think one of the things that was helpful in what we're talking about with Murray is to kind of see that both of them really are just two sides of the same coin, and that's this view that America is somehow the exceptional place and Catholics have an obligation to sort of work for it. And I think what the radical critique that we're talking here kind of isn't buying into that and never has bought into that. And
so what's this is a great point, and was one of the topics you sent, Mike. Oh God, can we just go another 5 minutes here? Look, the deal is this.
I was just about to teach at you saying we need to get out, but that's okay.
No, just a question of, because I do think what afflicts so many Catholics in the United States is a sense of American exceptionalism. But what's the difference between American exceptionalism, patriotism, nationalism, and all those? Maybe we'll save that for our next episode.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, I mean, patriotism is love of country, but why do we say love of nation state? I always used to say when I was in South, I'm patriotic to Michiana.
Well, yeah, I'm patriotic. When people, ask me where you're from, I don't say I say I'm from Nebraska. I've lived in Pennsylvania for 30 years, and when people ask me where I'm from, I say, "Oh, I'm a Nebraskan. I'm from Nebraska." I loathe the notion that I'm a Pennsylvanian, and I reject it utterly. But so it does point out, that I think there's a localist dimension to patriotism as the virtue that it is. That nationalism doesn't have. But this will be saved for we're going to get the band back together one more time. We'll discuss that, and we'll discuss the state of the Catholic worker movement. Anyway, I have taxed your patience long enough, gentlemen. Thank you for spending an hour and a half with me here. Great conversation. I loved every second of it. I hope the viewers and listeners did too. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Oh, now I just need to figure out how to stop recording. Stop recording.